I'm Professor Nancy Horowitz. I'm the director of the Elie Wiesel Center for Jewish Studies, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon for this lecture that's part of the Yitzhak Rabin Memorial Lecture Series. Yitzhak Rabin was a visionary leader who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1994 for his dedicated efforts to make peace between Israel and its neighbors. We honor his work by bringing major speakers to the university who address issues of peace and human rights. This year marks the 30th anniversary of the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, which happened in November of 1995. It's also the 20th anniversary of the Yitzhak Rabin Lecture Series at Boston University. I want to thank Jonathan Krivine, who is here in the front row, for his generous endowment. That is very well deserved applause, I must say, because not only did he start the lecture series and endow it, but he's been such an integral part of the planning for the event, the PR for the event, everything about the event, helping to find speakers. He's been really a marvelous addition to our efforts. I will now introduce Professor Tim Longman, who will introduce our illustrious guest, Ambassador Eizenstat. Professor Longman will also ask and answer questions at the end of the talk and serve as moderator. After the talk and response, there will be time for a discussion from the audience, and a reception will follow on the second floor of this building. We will lead everybody downstairs to the second floor. Timothy Longman is professor of political science and international relations at Boston University, where he serves as associate dean for academic affairs at the Pardee School for Global Studies. His research focuses on state and society in Africa, particularly human rights, transitional justice, the politics of race and ethnicity, sexuality and gender, and religion and politics. He has published 2 books on Rwanda, Christianity and Genocide in Rwanda, and Memory and Justice in Post-Genocide Rwanda. He's currently writing a book on church-state relations across Africa. He's served as a consultant for USAID, the International Center for Transitional Justice, the Justice Department, and Human Rights Watch in Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Please join me in welcoming Professor Longman to the podium.
Am I on? There we go. Great. So I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today, whom we're quite fortunate to have joining us. Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat is a noted diplomat and author who has served in 6 U.S. administrations. He's received over 75 awards, including the Great Negotiator Award from Harvard Law School, and high honors from the governments of Austria, Belgium, Germany, Israel, and the United States, as well as 2 Legion of Honor Awards from France. Within the United States government, was initially on the White House staff of President Lyndon Johnson. He's since served as the chief White House domestic policy advisor to President Johnson. In the Clinton administration as U.S. Ambassador to the European Union, Undersecretary of Commerce, Undersecretary of State, and Deputy Secretary of the Treasury. He was also Special Representative of the President and Secretary of State on Holocaust issues in the Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations. He's the chairman of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum Council, appointed by President Biden, which is life coming full circle for him since his recommendation that President Carter appoint a presidential commission on the Holocaust chaired by Elie Wiesel led directly to the creation of the museum. Ambassador Eizenstat has also written several books, including President Carter's years, The Future of the Jews, How Global Forces Are Impacting and Its Relationship with the United States, and Imperfect Justice, Looted Assets, Slave Labor, and the Unfinished Business of World War II, in addition to Art of Diplomacy, which he'll talk about today. We are thrilled to welcome this renowned diplomat and policy expert who has been so instrumental in advocating for global attention to Holocaust justice issues. Please join me in Stuart Eizenstat.
Really a thrill to be here. I want to thank Jonathan for your contribution to making the Rabin lecture possible, Nancy Horowitz, who's been my liaison and director of the Elie Wiesel Center, and Tim, thank you for the kind introduction. This is really a special event for me because it weaves together many strands of my life. My late wonderful wife, Fran, received her master's in social work at Boston University. And a number of my Harvard Law School classmates are here, including Ambassador Barry White and others. I have two longtime personal friends, Rachel and Josh Kogan-Habib, who are here, Ambassador Alan Solon, who just joined our Holocaust Memorial Council. So for those reasons, it's also special. But there are two other reasons. One is that we're at the Elie Wiesel Center for Jewish Studies. And it's more important than ever at a time of rising anti-Semitism. I was fortunate to have a very special relationship with Elie, who taught at BU and has been an important part of my life. In April 1978, when I was President Carter's chief White House domestic policy advisor, I recommended that the president create a Holocaust commission to look at the best way in which we could remember the Holocaust victims. And I suggested that there was only one person who should chair that commission, and that was Elie Wiesel. He was the face, the voice, the soul of Holocaust survivors, and had become a vocal defender of human rights and an advocate for victims of oppression around the world. I explained to the president that in his 1960 book, Night, among 50 others he had written, he brought the horrors and experience of his own in Buchenwald and Auschwitz to the American and English-speaking world. I called Elie through the White House operator, who can find a man on the moon, literally, and tracked him down in Jerusalem. He actually turned down the offer. He said, I'm not the right person for this. I'm a writer. I'm a scholar. I'm not someone to lead a presidential commission. I persuaded him that he was, in fact, the only person who could. We could find plenty of administrators to manage the commission, but we needed his seal of approval to obtain presidential, public, and congressional support for whatever the commission would choose to recommend. And we didn't know. It could have been a statue. It was, in fact, the Holocaust Memorial Museum, so chairing it now is life coming full circle. The last crucial strand tonight is that I'm giving the Yitzhak Rabin Memorial Lecture. He was a hero and a friend. He combined bravery on the battlefield with courage in seeking peace at the negotiating table. He was the chief of operations in the pre-state Palmach during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, the chief of the general staff of the IDF, and the leader of Israel's victory in the 1967 Six-Day War. He became the first native-born prime minister of Israel. And he recognized, and this is a lesson for sure for today, that Israel needed to combine its military prowess with relentless diplomacy to seek peace. He had the confidence of the Israeli public and the respect of the Palestinians, including Yasser Arafat. I first met him on his first state visit, and the first state visitor we had to President Carter in March of 1977. He was stern. He was a man who engaged in no political pleasantries. He was all business, and the business for him was Israel's security, which he realized had both a military and a political dimension. In 1987, my late wife Fran and I were at a small dinner at a Tel Aviv restaurant with Yitzhak, his wife Leah Rabin, Itamar Rovanovich, his top advisor, and his wife Efrat. The first violent intifada had just broken out. And I asked him naively, why were the Palestinians demonstrating violently? Between puffs of his proverbial cigarette, he gruffly said, because they don't want us to occupy them. In 1993, I was at the White House ceremony where Yitzhak, President Clinton, and PLO head Arafat signed the Oslo Accords, the mutual recognition between the PLO and Israel, and to some, the high watermark of the peace process. He was criticized bitterly in Israel for signing an agreement with a terrorist group. And he responded, "You make peace with your enemies, not your friends." Responding to terrorist attacks which threatened the Oslo peace process, he famously said, "We must fight terrorism as if there's no peace process and work for peace as if there's no terrorism." I remember exactly where I was on November 4th, 1995, almost 30 years ago, when I received the news of his assassination by Yigal Amir, a right-wing extremist who opposed the Oslo Accords, when I was hosting a reception in my U.S. government residence in Brussels. I felt then, and even more strongly now, that this one bullet changed the entire course of the Middle East peace process. I believe had he lived, there would be a greater chance than ever for the peace between Israel and the Palestinians that we lack today. Now, for my book. I wrote this book for 3 reasons. The first was we live at a turbulent time when there seemed to be endless, unsolvable problems. And I wanted to demonstrate through 12 examples that we had successfully used diplomacy for equally daunting problems and could do so again. Second, we're in the midst of 2 hot wars in Gaza and in Ukraine. And I wanted to demonstrate how, in the past, we have gone through a series of wars in our lifetime. Vietnam, the 2 Iraq wars, the 2 wars in Kosovo and in Bosnia and the Balkans, the longest war in American history, the Afghan War, and the war in Libya, which President Obama said was his worst mistake. And obviously, we've had a mixed success in combating wars and diplomacy. And so I wanted to take a hard look at what lessons could be learned from those wars to apply to the wars we have today and we may face tomorrow. When can diplomacy successfully use armed force and when can it not? The act of diplomacy is very simply said. It is making the other side, the other country, believe that what's in their interest is in ours. It has to be a win-win situation. It's not a winner-take-all poker game. The other side is a sovereign nation that has to be able to come back to their country, to their public, to their leaders, and show that what they've agreed to is in their interest as well. And in interviewing 130 people for this book, almost every Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, CIA directors, leading generals, I found that there were a common set of skills that were crucial for success. Not that alone. You can a negotiator is not some knight on a white horse who comes with a sword and solves problems. If the people themselves on each side are unwilling and can't find a common bridge, as we have with Hamas and Gaza, no amount of great diplomacy will work. But you really have to start with having the right person at the right time on the right issue. It's unthinkable that we would have had the opening to China without Henry Kissinger, or Camp David without Jimmy Carter, or the Bosnia Accords at Dayton without Dick Holbrooke, or the Good Friday Agreement without George Mitchell. They were essential. And here were the skills that they brought. First, a sense of grabbing history when it was occurring and having a fierce determination to bring it to a successful conclusion. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and George H.W. Bush and Jim Baker, who wrote the preface to this book, saw this as a historic opportunity to finally reunite the 2 Germanys split into 2 after World War II, a Soviet zone and a Western zone. And doing so was an enormous lift. All our allies were against a united Germany, every single one. For example, Margaret Thatcher, who was then the Prime Minister of the UK, said, "I love Germany so much I want to keep 2 of them." After all, they had fought 2 world wars. The Soviets had lost 20 million people. But they were able to do it. Second is courage. Not the courage of a soldier on the battlefield, but the courage of the people you see here who are willing to take political risks for peace, to break oftentimes with their own constituents, with their own political base, to end wars and take peace. When Sadat goes to Jerusalem, he lost his foreign minister the day he announced that he was going to Jerusalem, and lost a second one at Camp David. He resigned on the spot because he thought Sadat was giving away too much. Other examples, more recent, 2020, Mohammed bin Zayed, the Crown Prince of the UAE, makes peace with Israel. Not popular at home. He had his own reasons for doing it, which we can discuss later. Third, and they won 2 Nobel Peace Prizes for it, the heads of the Catholic and Protestant communities who had gone through a 20-year civil war, which the British, in typical British understatement, called the Troubles. Well, the Troubles had killed 3,500 people and named tens of thousands. And finally, the leaders of those 2 communities said, enough is enough. We've got to find a way to live together. We can't keep going like this. That took courage. Next is a high degree of intelligence combined with wisdom and a good sense of how people operate. Henry Kissinger, who wrote the foreword to this book, and by the way, he wrote the foreword just before his 100th birthday, and Zhou Enlai, the premier of China, showed that kind of intelligence and wisdom in the opening to China. Next is preparation. There is no substitute for being totally prepared, for knowing your brief, your issues, but understanding the other sides as well, because that's the only way in which you can find a real compromise. Example, we're in the 13th and last day at Camp David. Jimmy Carter has written 22 peace agreements and shuffled between the Israeli cabins and the Egyptian cabins. We're close, but not there. Begin comes to Carter's cabin Sunday morning, 13th day. Everyone agreed this was the last day, and said, Mr. President, I cannot and will not make any more compromises. I'm going home. I want you to get a limousine to take me from here to Andrews Air Force Base. I've got an El Al plane waiting to take me to Jerusalem. I'm sorry, I've done everything I can. Well, Carter realizes that if Sadat goes home empty-handed after this courageous act of going to Jerusalem, it would only take potentially his life, which was taken later, but it also would reflect obviously badly on the president himself. So because of his preparation, he had thoroughly read the CIA reports, the profiles on Sadat and Begin, and knew that Begin had a great love for his 8 grandchildren. So he hurriedly calls his personal secretary, Susan Clow, asked her to make 8 copies of the original photo of the 3 leaders coming in on day 1 to Camp David, and then autographs each personalized to each of the grandchildren, walks over to Begin's cabin, hands him the 8 photos, and sees Begin go through each, vocalize the names of each, Jimmy Carter with hopes for peace, and he sees Begin's eyes tear and his lips quiver. He puts down his suitcase and he says, Mr. President, for my grandchildren, I'll make one last try. And that's when it was resolved on that 13th day. I'll tell you a funny story, if time permits, about how the treaty got done. Next is developing a personal relationship with your adversary. You cannot see them as an enemy to be ground down. They have to become a partner in success. At a difficult time in the German reunification talks, Jim Baker decides to take Edward Shevardnadze, the Soviet foreign minister, his counterpart, to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, his retreat. And they spend 2 days together, no aids, talking about peace, talking about a reunited Germany, talking about the life they want their children and grandchildren to have. And it breaks down Shevardnadze's resistance. He finally comes back, goes over the head of the foreign ministry, and convinces Gorbachev to accept not only a reunited Germany, but a reunited Germany within NATO. We can talk more about that later, because we're back at that again. Next is creativity. I call this the art of diplomacy because there is an art. It's like a painter painting on an easel. You're always going to have seeming impasses, walls that seem impenetrable in negotiations, and you have to be creative to get around them. And sometimes you become creative, frankly, by creating ambiguity. 1967 war, the UN resolution 242, Land for Peace, says Israel must withdraw from, quote unquote, all territories. But it doesn't define what territories. Each has a different meaning. We're still fighting over that now, but at least we got over that bridge. When George Mitchell was doing the mediation between the Catholic and Protestant parties, there were two great hurdles. The first was that the war was still going on. The militias were still killing each other. And the parties said, how can we negotiate while we're still doing this? But he was unable to get the militias to disarm because each distrusted the other. And so he came up with what became known as the Mitchell Principles. He said, you can keep your arms, but you have to sign this piece of paper saying you're going to try to resolve your conflicts peacefully. And that got us over that hump. Next is stamina. International negotiations are like a marathon with a sprint at the end. You have to really be willing to spend not just weeks and days, but sometimes years. And it always seems to end at 3 o'clock in the morning on the last day. The whole term shuttle diplomacy came from Kissinger spending 2 weeks with almost no sleep, going between Cairo and Damascus and Jerusalem, and trying to get a peace on the Golan Heights. Jimmy Carter averaged 2 hours of sleep for 13 days. When I was negotiating the Kyoto protocols in Japan with 190 countries, our team averaged about 3 hours of sleep at night. So you've got to be able, when that last time comes, to be able to be not just awake, but alert and ready to come up with the last compromise. Next, using another sports term, and with the Red Sox, hopefully they'll do better than last year. They can't do worse. Is don't swing for home runs. Go for singles. If you try to get too much, it will load an agreement down and make it impossible. So, for example, Jimmy Carter started wanting a totally comprehensive Geneva conference with all 22 Arab states and Israel to resolve everything, the West Bank, the Golan Heights, the Sinai. It was too much, and it collapsed. We ended up at Camp David with only the Egyptians. The Palestinians wouldn't come because they didn't accept UN Resolution 242. And so by taking that, let's call it a single, we have an agreement that's lasted more than 40 years, including through the Gaza war, and that became the foundation for the Abraham Accords, and hopefully ultimately for the Saudis. So take what you can get and then build on it. Don't go for too much. Next, there are often times when you have to use what we call back channels. That's when the two parties are so antagonistic they literally won't get in the same room together. That's what happened with Iran and the United States leading up to John Kerry's negotiation of the nuclear agreement. That's what's happened now with Hamas and Israel. They've never gotten together. They're negotiating through Qatar and Egypt. And those back channels are absolutely essential. The way the Oslo Accords were done was through the Oslo process that was so secret, and it was not done with diplomats, it was done with friends of the two opposing sides, the PLO and Israel. So much so that when Yossi Beilin came to Rabin, the prime minister at the time, with the Oslo Accords. Rabin did not know about them, literally didn't know about them. And Yossi said that the worst day of his life was thinking that Rabin would be angry and would shut the whole thing down, which thankfully he didn't. But those back channels, again, are absolutely essential. Next, there is always when a president gets elected, thinking that he can do something better than his predecessors. And he tries, therefore, sometimes to walk away from agreements that his predecessors have done. Let me give you two examples of doing it the right way and doing it the wrong way. In the 1980 election, we got totally shellacked by Ronald Reagan. And there were a whole number of reasons, inflation, a hostage crisis, but Reagan also said that the SALT II nuclear agreement that we had negotiated gave too much to the Soviets and too little for us. And yet, when he was elected and served, he punctiliously followed to the letter during the entire term SALT II, because he realized that if he didn't, his opportunity to try to get the Soviets to do the next step, which he did in the START agreement, would be undercut if you pulled the rug out. Donald Trump has done just the opposite twice. First, he pulled out of the nuclear agreement, which we call the JCPOA, the 2015 nuclear agreement, saying he was going to do better, he was going to employ tough measures. Well, what's resulted? Under the JCPOA, 2/3 of the Iranian centrifuges were totally disabled. Today, there's a whole new generation of centrifuges churning out uranium even faster. Second, we got the plutonium plant at a place called Iraq cemented in so it couldn't be used. Now it's operating again. We had the most intrusive inspection ever by the International Atomic Energy Agency. Cameras everywhere. Now those have been disabled. And now we have not 2% enriched uranium, we have 60% enriched uranium, which can go to 90% within weeks. We have the Iraq revitalized and the uranium being churned out even faster. There's always a cost to be paid to think you can do better and not build on those instead of abandon them. And the same thing happened with the climate change agreements. He went out of the Paris Agreement in 2018, and I said the first week he's going to do the same thing, and unfortunately my prediction was right. And we go to China and we say, you are now the #1 emitter of greenhouse gases. You need to do more. And they say, who are you kidding? You go in and out of these agreements depending on who gets elected. We can't depend on you. And last is the use of leverage. Now, we all use leverage every day with our spouses, our partners, our children, our grandchildren. I found somehow the leverage of my grandchildren on me is greater than me on them, but that's another story. There are two types of leverage. One is negative leverage, and that's what is being employed now by President Trump in his second term with a whole raft of tariff measures. Economic sanctions are a form of leverage. During the Clinton administration, I was the so-called sanctions meister. I negotiated sanctions on the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act and the Helms-Burton Act. Economic sanctions are a tool, but they're not anymore dispositive. And the reason is that we aren't now in a globalized world with supply chains worldwide. We don't control everything as we did right after World War II. So just think, we have sanctions against Russia, real sanctions, but the EU is joining too. Putin is still moving forward in Iraq. We have sanctions against Iran. They've improved their nuclear game. We have sanctions against Maduro in Venezuela. He's stolen 2 elections and he's still there. So I'm not saying they shouldn't be used, but they're not sufficient. Second is the threat of war, not the actual use. So 1994, President Clinton gets a delegation of former President Carter, Colin Powell, and Senator Nunn to go to Haiti to try to convince the military dictator who has displaced and engineered a coup against the elected prime minister to leave and have the elected prime minister come, and they're unsuccessful, even with these 3 stars, until Bill Clinton starts to send B-52s on the way to Haiti. He got the message and he left. The last and most difficult of the negative sanctions is the use of force. There are positive leverages. Our great marketplace, opening it up. When the UAE tried to negotiate normalization with Israel, the last thing they asked was not from Israel, it was from us. They wanted F-35 fighter jets, and we gave it to them, and it was the right thing for President Trump to do. The last negative is the use of military force, and having served in administrations, it's the toughest, most brutal decision a president has to make, to put young men and young women in harm's way. And I've learned the following lessons from talking to the generals and those who were negotiating the end of the agreements. The first is military force should be the last, not the first option. You should exhaust every other option, diplomacy, economic sanctions, the threat of force, before you actually go to military force. Second, it has to be in the supreme national interest of the United States. And here, Professor, we were talking about, you're an expert on Rwanda. President Clinton said his worst mistake was not sending troops in. Why? We just, at that point in time, because of Somalia and the Black Hawk Down, didn't feel it was sufficiently in our interest. There's a horrible genocide going on right now in Sudan. Horrible. Tens of thousands of Black Sudanese are being killed by Arab Sudanese, but it's just not in our national interest to have troops there. So again, knowing when it is crucial. Third is being able to have a political objective before you introduce troops. The lesson I learned from this was from none other than Condoleezza Rice, Secretary of State to George W. Bush, and to Steve Hadley, who was the National Security Advisor. And they said, we did it backward. We went into Iraq to depose Saddam Hussein before we knew what political objective we could reasonably achieve. And we should have done the political objective first and then built a military strategy around it, and we oftentimes do the wrong thing. Next is, if you're going to intervene, understand the history, the dynamics, the internal politics of the country. General Petraeus said to me, you have to have a nuanced understanding of the country, and we did not in either Iraq or Afghanistan. We didn't understand the nature of those cultures. Next is recognize that even the best planned military operation is going to have unexpected costs that may set you back. Two examples. Number one, in Afghanistan, it took us several years to understand that the Taliban had a safe haven over the border in Pakistan. If things got rough, they could rest, they could rearm, and we didn't appreciate how important that was. The second is what happened in 1999 in Serbia. To get Milosevic, the head of the Serbs, to the negotiating table over Kosovo, NATO, led by the US, bombed Serbia 77 straight days. One of those days, we bombed, by mistake, the Chinese embassy in Belgrade and killed a number of Chinese diplomats, which they still, to this day, think we did purposely. Of course it was a mistake, but the point is you're going to have these terrible kinds of mistakes. Israel had it in Gaza the first day or so when they bombed a truck from a famous chef who was delivering food. Next, if you're going to use force, it has to be, as Colin Powell said to me, decisive force. Here we can compare the two Bushes. In the first Bush, Bush 1, he gets 38 countries together in a coalition to try to get Saddam Hussein to come out of Kuwait. A very limited political objective, just go back to Iraq. He gets a UN resolution authorizing force. He gets a NATO resolution authorizing force. He gets 38 countries, and we have a force of 500,000 soldiers. Compare that with Bush II, his son 12 years later, who forgot all of his father's lessons. We go into Iraq this time with a much broader political effort to remake the whole society, but no UN resolution, no NATO resolution, no 38 countries, just a very thin number of allies. And Don Rumsfeld takes pride in saying to the American people, we're going to do this, quote unquote, with a light footprint, not 500,000 troops, not 100,000 troops, 10,000 troops. And we had to do surge after surge after surge to have enough decisive force. And we ended up drawing forces from Afghanistan and not having decisive force in either. And last, if you're going to use force, have good intelligence. Good intelligence is crucial. Examples. We went into Iraq under Bush II, supposedly because there were weapons of mass destruction. There were none at the time we invaded. What I found was that there actually were weapons of mass destruction, but Saddam had destroyed them before we went in. So if he did, why didn't he save his neck and his own regime? Because he felt that if he publicized the fact that he had destroyed his weapons of mass destruction, that he would strengthen his domestic enemies and encourage Iran to invade. I was part of one of the most horrific intelligence mistakes in American history. Let's go back to 1978, 79, in the Carter administration. The Shah of Iran is our guy in the Middle East. We put him back on his throne in 1953. Republican and Democratic presidents gave him every arm that he wants. 6 weeks before he is forcibly deposed, 6 weeks, President Carter gets a CIA report, which I've seen and it's declassified, by the way, and the CIA report said Iran is in neither a revolutionary nor a pre-revolutionary state, 6 weeks before. And they didn't realize that our principal ally had incurable cancer and was not making sound decisions. That horrific set of intelligence forces led to a disaster which ended up denying Jimmy Carter a second term. And in Gaza, Dennis Ross and I chair a think tank in Israel called the Jewish People's Policy Institute of Jerusalem. And we've gotten briefings from several Israeli generals, and they said this was our worst intelligence failure, maybe even worse than the Six-Day War. Why? First of all, they said we didn't realize that Hamas had transformed himself from a terrorist group into a full-blown terrorist army, 35,000 strong, well-armed, well-trained. Second, yes, we knew they had tunnels, they told us, but we thought they were only the tunnels from Gaza leading into Egypt. We didn't realize there were over 150 miles of tunnels, some as deep as a 25-story building. Now, how do you build a tunnel that deep, that close to Israel, with the Mossad there, and not know about it? And Israel's paid a terrible price. Having said all of that, as we go to the question period now, diplomacy is crucially important. The alternative is war. War can sometimes do the job, but it has all the costs that I've mentioned. So Tony Blinken gave me what I think is the conclusion of this in his interview, and that is successful diplomacy depends on America being strong militarily, politically, and in terms of its values, and being united at home. If the other side, as Putin sees now, that we're divided at home, it undercuts the capacity for even the best negotiators to negotiate. So an end some way to the polarization we have is crucially important to the future of diplomacy. Thank you, and I'll be glad to take your questions.
Let me first say that the ambassador has asked that we work under what are called Chatham House rules, which basically means what's said here is not for attribution. It's the sort of original version of what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. So we asked basically that so that he can speak freely his opinion, you not necessarily quote him on this. So thank you so much for drawing on your really rich experience. I want to start with a couple of questions, then I'll turn it over to the general audience for questions. The first question I want to ask is, we are now 2 months into the Trump administration.
So I've noticed.
And what do you have to say to what's happening here? What does your book and your experience tell us about how to react to what's going on in our country right now?
So let's take the diplomatic side. I mean, we have to hope, he is our president, we have to hope he's successful, but he has basically turned on its head so many of the lessons that I just described. His diplomacy is unilateral, it's highly transactional. He looks at each as a sort of real estate deal. So, for example, yes, we'll help Ukraine if we can get their minerals, their special minerals. Now, most recently, just this week, yes, if we can run their nuclear plants. Second, his model is not Ronald Reagan, it's not the two Bushes, it's not Dwight Eisenhower, all Republican presidents. It's, interestingly, a president who began serving in 1897, William McKinley. William McKinley loved tariffs, and he believed in expansive imperialism. It was during his tenure that we added Hawaii and Guam and the Philippines. And what was lost in not looking and parsing carefully what President Trump said in his inaugural address, and I'm quoting, "America must expand our territory." Didn't get any headlines. Well, that explains wanting to buy Greenland. It explains talking about Canada as the 51st state. It explains wanting to take over Gaza and make it the Riviera of the Middle East. It explains calling the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. It explains why he talks about taking Panama Canal back from the Panamanians. On the unilateral side, instead of trying diplomacy first, instead of trying negotiations first to achieve these goals, instead, again, it's unilateralism without any allies. Tariffs against even our closest allies, against Canada, Mexico, the European Union. It's withholding intelligence and arms to Ukraine 3 weeks ago at a time of maximum peril. It's totally abandoning soft power, and USAID was a perfect example. It's an agency that does so much good and gave us such a great name in so many countries. And then let's look at a couple of specifics that I mentioned were necessary. One was preparation. Well, the president made many of these pronouncements in the first weeks in office before he even had a cabinet in place. There was no interagency review, none at all. No decision memorandum with everybody's views. He just announced it. Next is the ability to listen to the other side and put yourself in the other side's shoes. So this is what Larry Summers called unsympathetic empathy. And let me give you an example. I didn't talk about this in the opening remarks. It's maybe the most important thing. Sometimes you get so wrapped up in what you think is the brilliance of your own presentation, you forget to listen to the other side and to put yourself in their shoes. What do they need to take back to their capital? That is what you mean by a win-win situation. Well, here, there is no putting yourself in the other person. Quite the contrary. It's not looking at things. How will Zelensky think about this? How will Trudeau think about this? How will Sheinbaum in Mexico think about this? We're doing it this way, and this is the way it's going to be. Now, if it's successful, we'll see, but it certainly causes animosity, and it's not listening to the other side. Next, I talked about Jim Baker building trust with Shevardnadze. Building trust in the negotiating partner can be very difficult. I mean, when John Kerry was negotiating with the foreign minister of Iran on the nuclear agreement, it was very tough. They were very tough, but he developed a personal relationship, which was crucial, like Jim Baker did with Shevardnadze. Here, no effort at building a personal relationship with Trudeau, and now his successor, Carney. No effort at doing so with Sheinbaum. No effort at doing it with Zelensky. In fact, quite the contrary. In open television, the guy we've been supporting for 2.5 years is berated. Then respect for prior agreements I've already talked about. He's abandoned already the nuclear agreement with Iran and the Paris Agreement. And then in terms of not going for home runs, he's asked for the maximum. Gaza, we're going to take the whole place over. In Panama, we're taking it back. In Greenland, we're going to own it. I mean, they can only, even if it's an effort to, have a maximum negotiating posture, it's so out of the ordinary that anything he gets will look contrary. So I hope he can find ways to be successful. If he's successful, the country's successful. But this is a difficult way to start.
Thank you. One of the things that you talked about struck me was the degree to which your book highlights some of these diplomatic cases because it provides hope that things that seem intractable are not necessarily. I know when I started studying Africa, South Africa was clearly going to end in disaster. There was no solution. The white majority would not give up power, and there was inevitably going to be a bad civil war. But of course, that's not what happened. In fact, there was negotiation that was successful. You talk in your book about the troubles in Northern Ireland. I remember I was hitchhiking through Northern Ireland in 1985, and everybody there was like, there's no solution to this. All the moderates are leaving, and we won't, there's absolutely no way out. But turned out there was. When we look at the war in Gaza today, it seems like one of those situations where there is no way out and no solution. And I'm just curious if, since you dealt with Israel and negotiations there, what can you offer to talk about this situation that's ongoing?
So let me give you a personal example. When I was Deputy Treasury Secretary, as well as Undersecretary of State before that, I had a dual role, and that was to be responsible for the economic dimension of the peace process. So we had gotten Congress to pass a law that allowed any Arab country that had peace with Israel, and that time it was Egypt and Jordan and a Palestinian Authority, this was before the Abraham Accords, that they could set up an industrial park and have companies in it who, if they used as little as 10% Israeli content in their product, could ship back duty-free. So I'll give you a funny example before I talk about Gaza. I went to Jordan, to Irbid. It's a small town in northern Jordan, which had the first QIZ, qualifying industrial zone, in Jordan. And it's in the more fundamentalist part of Jordan. And I went into this massive plant. It was really like a half a football field in size. And there were women in fears, totally covered, stitching and sewing and so forth. And the manager of the plant said, Mr. Secretary, would you like to see what they're making? And I said, sure. So these fundamentalist women were making lingerie for Victoria's Secret. And I said, that's the peace process. Now let's go to Gaza. Okay, so in Gaza, this is now July of 2000. And we're not going to talk about the 18th century, July of 2000. I'm coming in as Deputy Treasury Secretary, and with the mandate of the peace process. And what I saw in Gaza in July of 2000 was really absolutely beautiful. There were 30 plants in this industrial plant, not Israeli plants, American, European, Japanese, and they were using a small amount of Israeli content and shipping back duty-free. And those 30 plants were employing 1,200 Gazans, and they showed me, Professor, the second phase that was already, the foundations were already being laid, with another 30 plants employing another 1,200 or 1,500 Gazans. I went into one of the plants, and I saw the product being loaded onto a flatbed truck that went straight through the Eretz crossing to the airport that we built, or had the Corps of Engineers build for the Gazans, a beautiful airport. There was one unarmed Israeli soldier overseeing this entire process. One unarmed Israeli soldier. Okay, now let's go to 2005. Ariel Sharon, a hardline prime minister, decides that Israel's presence in Gaza was counterproductive, and so unilaterally, because he felt he couldn't negotiate it, he pulled out every single Israeli soldier and had them pull out 7,000 settlers out of their homes forcibly. Now, I wish we could show all the kids demonstrating on campus that video of forcefully removing 7,000 Israeli settlers from their home. At the end of 2005, there was not one Israeli in Gaza. No IDF soldier, no settlers, and they left all the infrastructure, the greenhouses that they had used, our industrial park. You know, Hamas wins the election in 2006, takes over in 2007, and instead of getting roses, Israel gets rockets. At Camp David 2, I mentioned my Gaza thing. So I go back to Ramallah to negotiate. It was like the 5th or 6th time with Arafat. And I'm going to tell him about what a beautiful thing I saw and how we're going to build on it. And he says, I have something that you must tell President Clinton before you go into your talk. And I said, what is that? He said, tell him not to invite me to Camp David 2, the second Camp David summit. And I said, why? And he said, I'm not prepared to make the sacrifices and compromises that he wants. We invited him anyway. It was a failure. The second intifada occurred. The Clinton parameters at that time, 95% of the West Bank for a Palestinian state, and East Jerusalem as a capital. And then later, 2009, Prime Minister Olmert offers Abbas, the current president of the Palestinian Authority, who's now in his 16th year of a 4-year term. He offers Abbas 96% of the West Bank, making up the other 4% with land from Israeli Sinai and East Jerusalem as capital, and 50,000 Palestinian refugees coming back permanently for family reunion, turned down. So what's happened now is that we have the middle has collapsed in Israel. It was already collapsing, but it collapsed on October 7th. So pre-October 7th, even with all of the things I've mentioned, around 55% of Israelis favored a two-state solution. Now 27% do. Not just the far right. It's the moderate left as well. And we're therefore left with a really untenable position. And this is where I talk about going for singles and not home runs. There is no constituency for a two-state solution in Israel, and there won't be until there's some greater confidence. So we have to go for small things, like, for example, trying to find on the West Bank more joint ventures between Israeli and Palestinian companies, more freedom of movement in the West Bank, given the fact that Israel's got a wall. Small things that can begin to build confidence. Stop the payment by the Palestinian Authority of families of terrorists. Do it step by step. That's really the only way to proceed. We just don't have any other perspective of going for a home run, which is a two-state solution.
Great. Do we have some questions from the audience? And is there a mic that someone can?
There's a mic.
All right. Someone gonna? Do we have somebody who could pass it around? Okay. Great. Questions for the ambassador? Yep, we've got one over here. If you could just state your name.
Sam Murphy. To break the catastrophic tension, I've been always wondered about what happens inside the room. The doors close, you probably shake hands. How do you get started? Do you flip a coin who goes first? Do you arm wrestle? Or?
Okay, so the talks almost always start with great formality around a big table. Everybody's got their talking points from the capitals, and you quickly realize that this is a recipe for disaster. So what George Mitchell, for example, did in the Good Friday agreements, he had 13 political parties, and he started breaking them into small groups. And he would try to find out what one group wanted and then transmit it to the next group, and did it informally before he brought them together, even in smaller groups. The same thing happened again with Camp David. Camp David started with formality, and when Sadat read his opening comments for what he needed, I mean, Carter literally turned white because it was so excessive. And Begin just blew up. And they never met together again for 13 days. Carter would negotiate separately and come up with drafts based on what he said. And then finally, because Begin turned out to be more difficult than Sadat, Begin was a very tough negotiator. And so what Carter did is he really went around Begin and negotiated with Diane, the foreign minister, Weizmann, the defense minister, and most important, with the legal advisor, Aharon Barak, who later became Supreme Court judge. And Barak and Osama el-Baz, who was Sadat's legal advisor, and Carter were really the ones that made it possible. So you have to look at what the complexion is, look at the arithmetic. It's like a Rubik's Cube, but it's never going to be resolved, you know, at a major negotiating table. It's just not. And that's certainly one of the things. Now, I wanted to tell you a humorous story about the Egyptian agreement. So with the last minute negotiations that I mentioned about the pictures and the grandchildren of Begin, Camp David was called the Camp David Accords. It was not legally binding. It was a framework for peace, and it called for 3 months from the end of Camp David for a full-blown, legally binding treaty between Egypt and Israel. Okay, so 3 months go by, and Israel and Egypt aren't able to reach a treaty to flesh out Camp David. 4 months go by, 5 months go by, we're now in our 6th month, and we have a real crisis. And over the objection, and I'm not exaggerating, of every single one of his advisors, political advisors, myself, Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, it's one of the few things that Brzezinski and Vance agreed on, that Carter should not go to the region and try to conclude it. And he said, I've got to do it. I mean, I've got them this far, and I've got to take the risks for peace. I know I'll be humiliated if I leave and have to come back 5,000 miles, but I'm going to do it. So, okay, he spends 3 days shuttling between Egypt and Israel, between Cairo, Alexandria, and Jerusalem. He meets with the cabinet for 10 hours, the whole cabinet. We're close to an agreement, but again, we're not there. So it's a Sunday again, and we were at an impasse. Carter takes his suit and coat off. He gets into his flight outfit. The staff has all gone down to Ben Gurion Airport. Air Force One is refueled. The airspace has been cleared. And suddenly, Begin calls and says, "I'd like to see the president one last time." And we all thought, well, he just wants to say, "Thanks for coming. I'm sorry it didn't work." So, not being prepared for this, Carter redresses. Begin's very formal, puts a coat and tie on, and he says to us in the lobby of the King David Hotel, "Entertain the Prime Minister for a few minutes until Rosa and I get dressed." So Begin says, "Now, young men," he says, "you know the King David Hotel is a famous hotel." We said, "Yes, we know that." He said, "But not for the reasons you think. When I was head of the underground Irgun, I blew this hotel up with the British in it. Don't worry, I won't do it until Carter leaves." So he goes up to the presidential suite, and that's where the agreement was actually reached. The treaty, the binding treaty that's lasted, again, over 40 years. As they come down the elevator of the famous King David Hotel, it literally breaks between the first floor and the lobby. And the Secret Service had to pull Begin and Carter out butt first to get them down. And I call it the breech birth of the treaty.
Okay, a couple more questions. Got one there? Just say who you are, please.
Hello, my name is Kevin. Since October 7th, what would you say Joe Biden, Benjamin Netanyahu, and Donald Trump have done wrong and right in this ongoing crisis?
Okay, so that's a very good question. I think that, and it pains me to say that how little credit Biden has gotten for really sticking with Israel at great political cost. I mean, I am sure as I'm sitting here that we lost Michigan because of this. So I think that what Biden did was substantially correct. He let the Israelis go after the Hamas, time and again tried to limit the collateral damage, and came up with what is the operative plan right now until last week, which is the three-phase program. The first phase worked, which is releasing 100 hostages for about 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. The second phase was supposed to start 2 weeks ago, which would have been a permanent ceasefire, all the hostages released for, again, more prisoners, and Israel withdrawing fully. It was a good plan. The problem was the Prime Minister of Israel is not able to implement it because he would lose his coalition. And the Palestinians are not willing to do their end, which is Hamas disarming itself and letting an alternative government in. So you have a classic situation, and this is why I said at the very beginning, and really in answer to your initial question, that the two sides are simply so far apart that no amount of creative diplomacy can really get them together. That's just a reality. Now, at least Biden had a plan, and it was a plan. And I think if Harris had been elected, that there would be a real effort to make phase two work. The negotiations were supposed to start like now. Well, what Israel did is they wanted, and it was a reasonable request actually, they wanted to extend phase one by getting another 3 or 4 hostages out in return for a commensurate number of Palestinians, and extend the ceasefire, the temporary ceasefire under phase one for another 60 days. I think that was a reasonable plan. Hamas rejected it. Now Israel's come in with something that totally eliminates phase 2, which is resuming the fighting. And we're back where we started from. And it's very hard to see how we get out of it. What we were told also by these generals that briefed us for our Jewish People's Policy Institute, and they've said it publicly now, publicly. Hagari, who was the spokesman for the IDF, said it publicly, and that is, it is unrealistic to think we can eliminate Hamas. Now, we can eliminate them as a military force, as an existential threat, as a governing force, but they're going to be there. And it's just an unfortunate situation. So we have to build a creative governance structure, which actually the Arab League tried to come up with last week, and it was rejected by the Prime Minister. So, I mean, there are enough mistakes to go around 10 times over, and certainly the one that I mentioned at the beginning, which is the intelligence failure. You know that there was a young female analyst in the Mossad who had the entire plan, the gliders, the effort to dismantle the communication system, and as it made its way up the ladder to the top leadership of the Mossad, they said, there's no way Hamas can carry this out, it's too sophisticated. That intelligence failure was responsible for this calamity that we have. Now, one last thing. I really believe so firmly, and I've been to Israel like 50 times, my grandfather and great-grandfather are buried there. I feel very strongly that Israel's real security is putting Gaza in a broader context. And what do I mean by that? There is a real opportunity for a US-led moderate Sunni coalition to face Iran. They already have peace agreements, remember, with Egypt, with Jordan, with the UAE, with Bahrain, with Morocco, and the last piece is the Saudis. And that piece was going to come into place in the Biden presidency. We were within weeks of having it done, literally weeks. And I think that's why October 7th happened. Now the Saudis are having to raise their demand for the Palestinians. They say it doesn't have to be an immediate Palestinian state, but the prospect of it, and that's something that Bibi can't agree to. So I predict if I'm here 2 years from now, maybe a year from now, that the Saudis will be in that, but they're not there now. And that's Israel's real security.
We have time maybe for one quick last question. Yep, please.
A yes or no answer?
Yes or no answer, yes, exactly.
I'll try and keep it short, but one of the things that really disturbs me a lot right now with regards to our foreign policy is I think the damage that's being done to our global reputation, especially with our allies in the European Union and in other countries around the world. I'm wondering, in your opinion, what do you think the next generation of American diplomats should be doing in order to regain some of that trust?
Well, I'm going to talk about that, but I want to do it in the context of Ukraine, because we haven't talked about Ukraine. And I want to also recognize my dear friend Bonnie Meltzer, who's responsible for our marriage, Bonnie Rosenberg now. Here are some important lessons for Ukraine. Number one, Kissinger said, you can't, and this is a lesson for future diplomats, you can't achieve at the negotiating table what you don't earn on the battlefield. That's why it was so important to arm Ukraine fully. And here, I love Joe Biden. He appointed me to head the council. I've known him for 50 years. He did a great job keeping NATO together, but we were $1 short and a day late every single time in giving Ukraine when it really needed. We had the Russians on their heels. The Abrams tanks, the F-16s were delivered way too late. So that was a horrific mistake. Second, it's possible we may not have a formal treaty. And if so, we may have, at the end, the armistice agreement that settled the Korean War. There's never been a treaty between North and South Korea. We simply divided the line, the so-called DMZ, the demilitarized zone, and there's been no war for 70 years. Now, enforced in part because we have 30,000 American troops here, okay. But we may end up doing that. Third, and this is a real risk right now, and that is we must not negotiate behind Zelensky's back. We must not negotiate an agreement with Putin and impose it on Zelensky. I pray that we don't make that mistake, and we've done it twice in our history. The Vietnam War was negotiated by Henry Kissinger, no less, for which he got the Nobel Prize, between himself and the North Koreans without Saigon, for which we lost 58,000 men and women ever being in the room. Ever being in the room. And then later in Afghanistan, both under Trump and Biden, the whole negotiation was between the U.S. and the Taliban. The Afghan government was nowhere to be seen, nowhere. And we all wrung our hands when they collapsed after we left. So we have to make sure Zelensky's in the room. And last, I talked about being, this is again a lesson for future diplomats, about putting yourself in the other person's shoes. So let's now imagine we're in Zelensky's shoes, okay? We're negotiating and Putin's on the other side of the table. And he says to us, you Americans have a saying, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. He says, we've been fooled twice by Putin. Number one, 1994, the Budapest Memorandum. We gave up the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world in return for a pledge by Putin not to respect our sovereignty and not to invade, which he violated and took Crimea. Second time was in 2015, the so-called Minsk Agreement, which we, the United States, were co-signatories, in which the fighting stopped in the same area it's been in now, the Donbass area, in return for a pledge by Putin not to go any further in Ukraine. And he said 7 years later, exactly February 21st, 2022, 3 days before he invaded, he said publicly, Minsk is no more. So what is Zelensky supposed to do now? I mean, we're not going to let him into NATO, right? So I think if there is any solution, it's twofold. One, to get him in as quickly as we can into the European Union. And second, and here it's possible that Trump may have an idea that is worth considering. And that is, if we can get the U.S. deeply engaged in the economy, it will make it more difficult. And France and Britain and probably Sweden and maybe Germany are willing to put their own peacekeepers in. Not NATO, but individually. And if we can get the combination of that, that will give Zelensky, I think, some security. But Putin has rejected having any European troops. We'll see if that's a negotiating position or whether he can end. In terms of restoring trust, I mean, you know, you can do a lot of damage in a few weeks. And it will take a long time to rebuild trust in our allies. The president doesn't care about allies. He doesn't care about our alliances. We have to have a president who comes in and does care about them and rebuilds the trust step by step, just like I was talking about in Gaza. It can't happen overnight. You just can't put Humpty Dumpty together again immediately. But we've got to realize that we can't do it alone in this world. We had a terrific agreement that Biden negotiated between South Korea and Japan and the United States. Those were two mortal enemies, Japan and South Korea. Japan never apologized, as the Germans did, for the terrible things they did to the Korean comfort women. Never paid anybody. We had an agreement with building up an English-speaking group that included India and Australia and New Zealand. So they're there, and I think they are desperate to have the Americans there. I found out when I was in Europe, in the EU, with all the grousing about the United States, they definitely wanted us there. Barry, you were in Sweden. You know that they love-hate relationship, but they want the United States. So if we can show them that we've put this 4-year period behind us, and that we're willing to resume relations, I think we can start. But again, it won't happen overnight.
Well, thank you so much for sharing with us this evening. So,